share this with anyone who cannot make it this evening. Once again, good evening, Erev Tov. It's an honor to be with you. My name is Rabbi Or Rose, and I direct the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership of Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. And as you all know, we're here to celebrate the launch of Dr. Roz Weiner's new book. And there will be plenty of opportunities to learn about how to buy this terrific book throughout the evening. So if I don't announce it and you're looking for it, please look in the chat. The title, of course, is Seeking in the Company of Others, and the subtitle is The Wisdom of Group Spiritual Direction. Thank you, Grace, for placing it in the chat. It's an honor for us at the Miller Center to host this evening, to host Roz, who is a colleague and a teacher. And we're also thrilled to welcome Dr. Claire Wolfteich of Boston University, who is a theologian and a pastoral guide to many. Part of what will make this evening interesting is the relationship between Roz and Claire and the ways in which they have grown and evolved together through spiritual direction, among other things. Before we move into the conversation tonight, I'm going to invite my colleague, the Associate Director of the Miller Center, Reverend Tom Reed, to offer an opening prayer, and then I'm going to offer a brief nigun, a wordless melody, just to help us settle in from wherever we have rushed to be here so that we can give Roz and the work fuller attention. So Tom, when you're ready, we are with you.
Thank you, Or. It's wonderful to be with you all this evening. I wanted to share as a means of centering this beautiful litany for peace, written by Thich Nhat Hanh in this a New Zealand prayer book. And for those who may not be familiar, Thich Nhat Hanh was a wonderful interreligious hero, some call him, and I certainly consider him one. And he passed away earlier this year. May he rest in peace, but may his words speak to us at this time where the world is in desperate need for more peace. And as in many traditions, that idea starts within ourselves, and that resonates wonderfully with spiritual direction as well. So please join me in a spirit of prayer. And you can close your eyes if that's comfortable. You can assume any posture that feels good for you as we invoke these words from Thich Nhat Hanh, and there will be silence in between each statement. So take a few deep breaths as we bring ourselves into awareness and into this space, and exhale. Breathe in and exhale. Let us be at peace within ourselves. Let us accept that we are profoundly loved and need never be afraid. Let us be aware of the source of being that is common to us all and to all living creatures. Let us be filled with the presence of the great compassion towards ourselves and towards all living beings. Realizing that we are all nourished from the same source of life, may we so live that others be not deprived of air, food, water, shelter, or the chance to live. Let us pray that we ourselves cease to be a cause of suffering to one another. With humility, let us pray for the establishment of peace in our hearts and on earth. Take one more deep breath in and exhale. And in the words of another beloved professor of mine, let our breath be our blessing. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Tom, for helping us to center ourselves and be more present. And I'll just add one simple word in the form of prayer and melody, which is Shalom. 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 Again, welcome everyone. We are honored to be together and to be able to engage Roz in conversation about this Mazel Tov moment. Congratulations, Roz, on the publication of the book. And let me start by asking a very basic question. I know that there are folks who are with us tonight that are friends, family, students, colleagues who are familiar with spiritual direction, but for those that are not, and for those that are but may be interested in how you define spiritual direction, start there. What does that term mean to you? And then once you've laid that out, we'll turn to your journey into this discipline. But Mazel Tov, and tell us, what is spiritual direction?
First of all, thank you, Or, and thank you, Tom, for hosting me and celebrating with me. I appreciate it a lot. And to those of you who have come, and some of them, as Or says, are my family and my friends and my colleagues and people I don't know yet, I thank you for coming. Spiritual direction is turning one's attention and being helped to turn one's attention to the sacred moments of everyday life. And my favorite quote about my engagement with spiritual direction on behalf of other people is one by a Quaker philosopher, Douglas Steere, who said, "Holy listening, to listen another soul into life, into a condition of disclosure and discovery, may be almost the greatest service that any human being ever performs for another or oneself." So I feel spiritual direction is a service that one person or a person can perform on behalf of another. Or in my particular case, although I do a lot of individual direction, the group work is my passion. The question of how did I get to this point is an interesting question.
Tell us about that, and maybe you could say a word, particularly since you were already a masterful listener. You were involved as a therapist in doing exactly what you described, but from a different vantage point. So if you could help us understand how these things dovetail, why you decided to do this in addition to what you were already doing, I think it would be wonderful to hear.
Okay. Well, first of all, I will say that I have been having conversations with God at least in my adolescence, I know this was happening. But they weren't examined conversations. I called God, God. And I hadn't thought through a theology, and I hadn't paid much attention to what or how come I was doing this. It was just something that organically emerged from me. So I grew up, I went to college, majored in psychology, went to graduate school to become a clinician. I'm one of these early deciders, perhaps influenced by the fact that my mother was a social worker, and my father believed that you should have experience before you make decisions. And so I went to my first conference as a guest of a colleague of my mother's when I was 14 years old, and decided that I was going to be a therapist. I didn't know what kind, but again, I was an early decider. So when I went to graduate school finally, at the age of 22, to be trained, therapy training at that point focused on identifying a problem, understanding it within various theoretical frameworks. I got in trouble a lot because I wouldn't just choose one and swear allegiance to it. My sense always was that individual people or groups of people had their own way of being and doing, and I might have to adapt over the years if I was fortunate enough to be a therapist for a long time. But here's the big important part. One was required in training to leave all religious, spiritual matters outside the consultation room. And if, heaven forfend, you brought one of them up, what I was usually told was that when I matured, and they hoped it would happen soon, I would be able to have the strength to leave behind my affiliation with this patriarchal thing called religion. That didn't work for me, but I learned very quickly how to play the game. So I left it out of the consulting room, but not out of my own thoughts and feelings. As a psychologist, I was taught to diagnose, to identify psychological strengths and weaknesses, to take the patient's capacity into account, and do everything I could to fix and repair. That was my job, and I liked that job. And I did it actually until October of 2020. So I was a clinician in practice for over 36 years. But I was never satisfied. I wanted more inclusion of the various worlds my patients inhabited, and I wanted more teamwork, by which I mean I wanted consultants, I wanted a physician to be thinking about what my patients needed. I wanted whatever service they needed. I didn't want it to be limited just to the narrow confines of one way of doing things. And I wanted a clear partnership with the patient, but I lacked those tools. After a time, I had a personal crisis, which challenged my relationship with God, this God that was previously unexamined. And the reflections that I did with some rabbinic advice, it revealed what my stuck points were, but there were no solutions. Still, I lacked tools. Therapy helped me identify my spiritual and emotional pain, but it also offered no tools. So I was still stuck. I was stuck in my consultation room with my patients, and I was stuck personally. But what was very clear to me was that I had no intention of giving up my connection to God. Then I got lucky. In 1998, Mass General Hospital in their infinite wisdom decided to open clinical pastoral education, that's chaplaincy training, to healthcare providers. I applied almost faster than they printed the application. I got a 6-month half-time leave of absence from Tufts, well, the floating hospital where I was on the faculty and the staff. And I did CPE, and I loved it because I was able to talk about God as part of my day job. And I learned a lot of things. The most important thing I learned, and I think because I learned this, I was able to be a therapist as long as I was a therapist, because I learned that you can accompany and you can care, but you don't always have to fix. And sometimes you can't, but there are still things you can do. And that was very important work for me, but it wasn't enough, because being my father, the researcher's daughter, I also needed an intellectual framework for what I was trying to think through. And that led me to Boston University, into the School of Theology, where I was a candidate that they liked. I was a second career person. I was seeking a second, I didn't know I was seeking a second career, but I knew I was seeking a second kind of learning. I was a woman of a particular age. I already had a proven academic record, and I was Jewish. And that was relevant because there's always been many Jewish students, but there wasn't anybody that fit that particular niche at that particular moment. So they admitted me, and I went and I got a degree in theology. And while I was there, I had the good fortune to become Professor Wolfteich's student. And from her, I learned the words for the first time, spiritual direction. It could be serendipity, you can call it whatever you want, but it's interesting to me how easy it was for me to get admitted to graduate school at this time. And it was even more striking that while I was there in that very first year, I was there for 2 years, for the very first time through another branch of Judaism, there was a training program offered in spiritual direction. And it was the very first time that Jewish people were going to be trained by Jewish people to do spiritual direction. And again, I signed up for it as fast as I could. And I did that program also. The training program required that I be in spiritual direction. That was a challenge because in Boston at that time, there weren't any Jewish people trained in spiritual direction. So I had the good fortune to meet Reverend Gene Robinson, the recently retired Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire. And he found me my first he was a friend, and he found me my first spiritual director. And I've had 2 subsequent to that. One of them is on the screen tonight. And what I want to mention about that is that each of them has been Christian, and each of them has brought their own particular mirror to my experience and have helped me to grow. So I'm grateful for that. The second requirement, besides showing up for the classes and writing papers, was to be in a peer supervision group with people who were doing spiritual direction. And that I had been afraid was going to be an insurmountable challenge. But I had the good fortune to meet Sister Rosemary Brennan, who is the immediate past president of the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And she had convened a peer group. It had been meeting for several years, but they had never had a Jewish member before. But they decided that they were willing to learn how to, work side by side with a Jewish person. And I certainly was willing to do that. And they called me the novice, which I loved, because that is the Christian name for a person considering going into or has made a decision to go into the nunnery. So I went regularly for a long time to the Mother House of Sisters of St. Joseph. That peer group now is made up partly of Jewish people now and partly of Christian people. And it meets in my living room when COVID will end. So far, it's been on Zoom. With CPE and spiritual direction training, I now had the tools that I needed for my patients. But I felt drawn to give more. And I didn't know what that more was all about. But I paid attention to what I was noticing. And one of my children was in rabbinical school. And I started thinking about who looks after the spiritual lives, or who helps people who are in the business of taking care of those of us who are Jews in the pew. Who looks at how do those leaders, the clergy, how do they take care of their spiritual lives? And I started asking questions and doing some networking, and it was a tough sell. When I would go to see the rabbis, some would just say, "This is Christian work. Why are you doing this?" Some would say, it sounds interesting, but it's not how I would do it. And some would say, maybe you could tell me more about it. My father taught me that when you went to do, I guess you'd call it cold calling, you'd call it networking, and you find that somebody was polite enough, you'd be polite back. But if they clearly were not wanting what you were offering, you thank them for their service, you thank them for listening, but you then went ahead and said, well, who do you think I should be talking to? And don't leave without 2 names. So I did that for about 1.5 years until I found some people brave enough to try to sit in spiritual direction. And today I have groups and a book.
Thank you for sharing that wonderful story of the winding path from adolescence and those conversations with the divine to sitting in the classroom at Boston University with the divine Claire Wolfteich, who we'll introduce in a moment, and for having the chutzpah, the holy chutzpah, to follow your heart and to invite other people into the process who were willing and able to listen. So before asking you another question, I do want to introduce Claire, who is a professor of pastoral care and practical theology at Boston University and is a teacher to some of the folks on this Zoom call, and has done a lot of work in the area of spiritual direction and has thought a great deal about the formation of clergy, similarly to what Roz described before as an animating question relating to her work. So Claire, first of all, welcome and thank you for being here. And I would love for you just to enter the discussion by talking about your experience of spiritual direction, what it was like, what it is like to have Jewish students and colleagues, and anything else that you think is relevant at this point, given what Roz has shared so transparently and generously.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Rose. It's wonderful to be here. And Roz, it's an honor really to witness your book publication and celebrate that with you and with all those who are here. So for those of you, I love the phrase holy chutzpah. And if you can imagine Roz walking into a classroom at the School of Theology, into a class entitled Spiritual Guidance in the Christian Tradition, and situating herself in the class with the most wonderful openness, listening ear, and simultaneously authenticity in her own rootedness, tradition, and identity. And that impression, I think that those of you who know Roz, that will ring true. That impression has borne out over years now as Roz and I have continued our partnership after her graduation. I've invited Roz back into a number of my classes. I also teach a course called Sabbath Theology and Practice, and Roz has beautifully invited our whole class to her temple, has had Shabbat dinner in her home for our students from BU, and now has sort of brought her love of group spiritual direction and her love of working across difference and dialogue and learning from each other to a new interfaith spiritual companioning group that she has designed and is facilitating monthly. And I know that some here are in that group. And it's a partnership really between Hebrew College and BU School of Theology. So Roz, in a way, you're a bridge, right, between us, and you have helped to navigate and continue to navigate difference. You came into the class ready to learn from Christian authors and practitioners, and spiritual direction is a longstanding ancient practice in Christian tradition. It's really emerged from sort of the earliest roots in Christianity, where you had an elder who was guiding someone who was more of a novice, right, in the faith. So very much a spiritual direction would be the correct term there. Throughout history, it has taken different forms. Some were more a kind of mutuality of spiritual friendship. And think St. Francis of Assisi and St. Clare would be a typical example of that, where you have more an accompanying, two people walking together down a road. And you also have communities of guidance, right? Group spiritual direction does have roots within our Christian traditions as well. And, with the sense that we do learn from each other, and that kind of holy listening to another does help to midwife their soul into being. It helps to witness to the new life that is coming. And what I've really just found fascinating, first of all, just celebrating, as I was saying to Roz earlier, a person who walks into a classroom in a school of theology, which at that time, even when you came, Roz, was more predominantly Christian, I would say, than it is now. It's become even far more diverse probably now, but to walk into that classroom, to fully engage, and then a number of years later, to publish your own book with Spiritual Directors International, I just think is fantastic. And what I see in the book that I really love is some of what I loved from the very moment I met Roz. It's that combination of, speaking to a broad audience. This book is not intended for a Jewish audience only or a Christian audience only. It's intended to be a book about spiritual direction that can cross the boundaries of communities and can speak to multiple communities. And it also is one that carries some of the love of Judaism that I've always seen in Roz, and the insights, that distinctively Jewish insights also that emerge there. For example, when you're talking about Lectio Divina, you talk about, how your relationship with Scripture was very much intellectual, very much formed by the study of Torah and how important that was. But also, as you learned about Christian practices of holy reading or divine reading, you drew upon Judaism and its sense of, the person as the image of God, to a sense that, yes, God can speak to me individually in my own soul, in and through this word. So I think that there's a lot of your Jewish tradition that you love and wrestle with in the book. I think there is an openness and a conveying of some of the wisdom of other traditions, including Christian traditions. And I think there's very much an invitation to all to engage in spiritual guidance, and particularly group spiritual guidance. So I'll pause there so we can turn back to Roz.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Claire. It really is an honor and a pleasure to have you with us tonight. So Roz, let me follow that sharing by Claire with a question which is about the art of translation, broadly conceived. So you were fortunate enough to have some Jewish teachers in the realm of spiritual direction, but clearly many of the sources that you read and other important teachers were Christian or from the Christian tradition. And so I'm curious about what that was like in terms of bringing it back to the Jewish community. And if you could talk personally about, some of what Claire just described. We oftentimes fall into overgeneralizations about what is Jewish and what is Christian. And of course, it's always more complicated than that. So I'm thrilled just to ask you, Roz Weiner, as one Jewish seeker, therapist, spiritual director, what that has been like to, to engage in that act of holy translation.
Well, it's actually been quite wonderful, just as an emotional word. I was raised in a household where it was made very clear to me what it was being given to me, what it was I was being invited to transmit should I ever have children someday. And I went ahead and did that. I have 4 of them. But at the same time, there was an encouragement to notice that there was a world that was not just Jewish and that I was going to be part of it someday. So for example, when I was, I guess it must be middle school, before middle school and then middle school, I was in a Girl Scout troop. And I was the only Jewish person in the Girl Scout troop. It was Christmas, Hanukkah time. And there was going to do a craft project. We were supposed to paint a plate that the troop leaders, who were Christian, so it was for Christmas cookies. My mother knew that was happening. She paid very good attention to what was going to be going on in the troop. And she said, no problem, you can do that too. Just paint menorahs on the dish. So we'll have it for our Hanukkah cookies. And I have that dish in my dining room still. So the invitation was always in my growing up, this is who you are, but you can, not only can you engage freely, but you can also, you can tell about who you are and you can learn who they are, if you will, or the other is. So I start out with that as an advantage, I think. And so 2 days ago, I guess it was when we met, you asked me a question, which at that moment, you said, how is being Jewish reflected in my work? And I hadn't thought about that. So for the last 2 days when I've been meditating, that's what I've been thinking about. And I actually came up with a list. And with your permission, I'm going to share my list because I never had this before. So thank you. So number one, as a Jewish person, I am encouraged to seek and trust the still small voice deep within me without losing connection to the possibility of a transcendent source that guides and directs me. And I'm not confined by that, but that's there. I'm encouraged to do that. Well, that's noticing, right? That's noticing the movement of the sacred. So that's spiritual direction. So it's a Jewish thing to do. The responsibility to transmit to my children and then more broadly. I wrote a book because I have something to transmit. The work that I'm doing, because I won't be able to do it forever because I won't be here forever. But I'm hoping that the attitude that I have towards it is reflected sufficiently in the book that others will see that we can talk, regardless if we feel differently about religion, or my religion, your religion, another religion, we can still talk to each other. We don't have to be afraid. And here is a method. I'm big on tools. Here is a tool that could help you to do it. One of the things that I know for sure I get from being Jewish is the freedom to question without obligation to discern the one perfect answer for all time. And here I want to tell a very quick story. One of the summers I was at BU, I took a fabulous course in liberation theology. And I asked a lot of questions because it probably was the most absolutely Christian course I was taking in terms of the literature. And I had so much I wanted to know. And one day, one of my fellow students said, why do you feel you can ask so many questions? How did you get that way? And it wasn't said with any hostility. It was said with absolute, authentic curiosity. And I didn't have an immediate answer. But the next time we met, I brought in a copy of one of the volumes of the Talmud. And I opened it up. And I said, you asked me that question. Here is the answer. There's a question in the center of this page, and around it are all different people across generations of answers. And we don't have to vote. We can just learn from each of them. So therefore I get to ask questions. My tradition teaches me to ask questions. So that's the next thing. The recognition of the value of hearing and learning from multiple voices with no one human voice being the answer. The possibility of having been given gifts and being called to share them, and feeling an obligation to notice and respond when the need is perceived. It's part of how I became a therapist, but also a spiritual director. A membership in a communal people guides me to value learning with and from others. The Jewish liturgy opens an opportunity to imagine multiple ways of perceiving and experiencing the divine source. So that helps too. I don't have to I have lots of names for God now, but I don't have to use all of them. And my own discoveries in my own spiritual direction, a deep dive into engaging in how to continue to craft a meaningful relationship with God and remaining mindful that this relationship, like all relationships, is never, or at least seldom, static. So I translate, all of that is in me, and then I take what I learn and I move it through that.
I'm so glad I had the chutzpah to ask you.
I appreciate the question. Nobody's ever asked me that before.
And to push a little when you first said, right? I don't know. And thank you for taking up the invitation and sifting and sorting and going through that brief list. Claire, I'm going to invite you back and ask you what you heard, what sounds resonant, what sounds different or other, because both are important. And Roz, I want to cue you up too. That is, are there things that were new, different, and or difficult in terms of the path vis-a-vis, Christian sources and Christian teachers? But Claire, first, what do you hear? What sounds familiar? What sounds different? What sounds even challenging?
Yeah, I mean, the still small voice resonates and the questions resonates. I think the permission to ask questions maybe, so I'm Catholic, and I might say that I came away from my family feeling like I could ask questions because there was an appreciation for a kind of intellectual search. So I think that is there in some traditions as well, but I don't think to the degree that I have experienced it in Roz and in other Jewish colleagues, where the kind of the wrestling and the questions are so much a part of a kind of mutual search. And in fact, that seems to be one reason why the group seems important, Roz, in your appreciation for group direction, as well as individual, but especially group, that there's something in the being present together and listening together that's super important. I think one thing that I pick up from what Roz has said and what I've read in the book, that maybe a point of some difference is the kind of contemplative stillness that is very prominent in Christian spirituality. And I think, and from what Roz says, less prominent in Jewish spirituality. Not that it's not there, but that maybe the flip side of the appreciation of the discussion and the wrestling and the community, which is so important in Judaism, the sort of the stillness, the simply being present, and the contemplative kind of stillness. I picked up from the book that this was something that you really appreciated about some of the Christian spirituality that you studied, Roz, and you have incorporated that into your structure very much so. And even you've also kind of wrestled with how to work with text, how to work with text differently maybe than you were formed to work with text, but in ways that are fully consonant with it, and yet, introducing poetry, introducing some other ways of sitting with the word. So those are just a few points that stood out. But I'd be interested in having Roz respond more to your second part of your question. I'm happy to come on back.
Thank you so much, Claire. Roz.
Ask me the second part of the question. I'm sorry, I got so caught up in what Claire was saying just now and thinking about it. Ask me the second part of the question again.
Good, you're modeling what you're speaking about. You're listening rather than planning your response. And
yes,
halavai, we would say, if only more people would listen more deeply and not plan their responses while others are speaking. So were there new learnings? Were there learnings that were challenging? Were there learnings that you felt were absent until you encountered them, through these Christian sources in your Jewish journey? Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but you as a Jewish seeker, teacher, therapist, you read such and such and there was an opening or an aha, or no, that is interesting, but not something I'm going to take with me.
Yes, yes, and yes. By which I mean, I still vividly, almost in my body, remember my first time doing Lectio Divina, which is a Christian practice that I learned, that I studied with Claire. which involves receiving from the text at a very personal level. I used to study the text. I still study the text. I love to study the text. It makes my juices flow. But this was a finding something in me in response to the text. I wasn't worried about what did God intend, or what did Rabbi so-and-so from whichever period, or Moses want me to learn from the text. It was, what did it stir in me? And that was such an important moment for me. And I think that's why I then was receptive to learning how to do this thing. So that's the first thing. And then the power of silence, of absolute quiet. It is probably the hardest thing that I need to teach when starting a new spiritual direction group, if all of the members of the group are Jewish. Because we're used to talking. I mean, talking in conversation, but quieting it down and to help people discover that from within them, they have things to hear. So I took that on, but I'll tell you what I didn't take. I did not take the idea of praying for each other as an active part of the spiritual direction process in situ. I didn't take that because it's not what we do. It's not that I'm opposed to it, but we pray for someone with a health problem or some kind of personal crisis. It's part of our, it's usually in most of our services, but just 3 to 6, 7 people sitting together. If someone has a problem and says, oh, just pray for me on that, I would have no problem with it, but I didn't want to build it in at the front end in 2003 to these groups that I was trying to start, because I knew it wouldn't fly. And also I was very mindful of the fact that I am, and proud of it, I'm a Jew in the pew, and I was going to be sitting with rabbis. Took me a bit internally to get up the chutzpah to do that, but to ask them to pray. And once or twice, and I mentioned one of the times in the book, I actually invited it, and it went over like a lead balloon. Nobody's ever rude or impolite, and most times if people trust the process enough to keep on coming, they'll let me say what I need to say, but it wasn't picked up as something people wanted to do. So that's something I did not take on.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing 1, 2, and 3. So tell us a little bit about group spiritual direction. And Claire, I think your insight is apt, which is to say, here is this Jewish seeker and therapist that enters the realm of spiritual direction, and much of it in the Christian context is about the individual in relationship, to a director, not exclusively, but much of it. And Roz, you still do some of that work, but the group, right? But the group context really became a passion for you. Say more about that, please.
Well, I read the work of Sister Rosemary Doherty, who is the key person, I think you would say, of the 20th century, and now into the 21st. I mean, her work is very definitive. She had a way of doing it through the Shalem Center. I had the privilege of going there for a 3-day conference some years ago and actually experienced it under her guidance. And it was powerful. It was powerful in the sense of multiple witnesses, all looking in the same direction, but all being different human beings, and all of us having the responsibility to be present with each other. And that seemed very powerful to me, to discover the power of sacred quiet while in the company of other people, to have an opportunity to articulate your own spiritual meanings, to discover them in a group context that is full of kindness and compassion. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. Nobody's going to tell you not to think it. Nobody's going to challenge it. They're going to receive it with gratitude for the fact that you have chosen to open your heart in that way. And to discover spiritual insights while in the company of others, insights which can be very intimate, but often communal. So to discover that somebody else might feel something that you do, or learn from what they feel, something that opens something for you that you didn't know was there to be opened. And then my personal favorite, learning how to listen deeply on behalf of another person. Now you'd think as a therapist, I would have learned that already. But the truth is, as a therapist, I was definitely hearing what somebody else was saying. But meanwhile, I was thinking, should I be responding to that? Should I let them talk some more? Does this going to help? Do I need to get them some medicine? You know, there's always 2 layers going on, at least 2 layers. You don't have to do that in spiritual direction. You can wait. If somebody says something that is very moving or meaningful, and this happens in individual as well as in group, it is perfectly permissible for me to say to the person, that sounds like it was really important to you, and I know it moved me. Let's both take a little quiet so we can reflect on what we both just experienced. You know, it's, you excuse the thing, but it's the pause that refreshes. So this deep listening is really important stuff.
I would imagine, Roz, not having been a part of one of your groups, that in contexts with students or clergy, Jewish and Christian, that are taught to tease apart text and ideas and such, that cultivating the appropriate ethos around theological questions is complicated. That is to say, someone says something about God. You've mentioned God several times, and there's an impulse that I have, you know, listening to you, which is to inquire further. Is God transcendent or imminent? You mentioned both. What do you mean when you say God is present? Is God a person in that sense for you, or God a force? You know, all of the great questions, you know, that we've explored in different ways, from the Tanakh to Buber and Heschel and onward. So I'm just curious about that kind of balance in terms of the risk perhaps of over intellectualizing or of deconstructing, or, you know, fill in some of the gaps, because I think your facial expression indicates that you understand some of that tension.
Well, I was thinking that you would, I mean, no disrespect, you'd be a hoot to have in a group, because I'd have to work very hard to help you to permit yourself the privilege of not having to think so much. In that sense, so that you could notice a bit more about what is moving within you at that particular moment in time in response to something that I've offered to you in terms of material. So the question, you're the manager of time. In terms of how our time is going, am I going to get to read a poem, or?
Yes, we're going to do that next. So you can say another word or two, or just say what you and others might benefit from most is just diving into the exercise. So you decide.
I'd rather go into the exercise, because I think by doing it, you can see and feel a bit of how that works.
Wonderful.
And I have a great poem that I haven't tried on anybody before. I got a new one today. So I'd like to do that. So I'm going to, right now, if I'm on speaker, I want to go to gallery so I can talk directly to everybody and see them. So there are lots of parts to a group spiritual direction meeting, and I'm going to just offer you one of them. And that is the Lectio Divina, which is what first opened my heart to spiritual direction. So I want you to have that same experience. And I'm going to read you a poem, and I'm going to read the poem twice, hopefully slowly enough. And the first time I'd like you just to receive the poem, hear the poem. The second time, though, I would like you to notice whether any of the words, if you saw them in front of you, would appear bolded, as in, these are your words today. And when you have your words, if you could just put them into chat, nothing's going to happen with them for everybody, but I want people to see the different things that people respond to. Hopefully that makes sense. And now I'm going to go ahead and read it the first time. The poem is called Adrift, and it's by someone I don't know, I've never heard of his work before, named Mark Nepo, but he's described as a spiritual writer who does a lot of poetry. And I like this poem, so I'm going to present it to you. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch, as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I am so sad, and everything is beautiful. Now I'm going to read it again, and this time I invite you to notice which words within this poem, it could be one word, it could be 5 words, whatever, are your words tonight. Adrift by Mark Nepo. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch, as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I am so sad, and everything is beautiful. So take a moment, and when you're ready, if you would be willing to put your words into chat. And if you don't want to, that's okay. Carolyn, you have a question. I can't hear you because you're muted.
You can't chat the whole group. Mine says Grace Harrington and I can't change it.
I just adjusted the settings. I think it should
Oh, here
work
I go.
now.
I got an everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Didn't know that was on.
So while you're writing things into chat, I'm going to give you the next part of what happens. So after I've read the poem, and people, remember there will only be 3 to 6 people in a group. So people would just say their words aloud. And then I would say, take your words into quiet, let them sink down in you as deep as they go, and see what comes up in you to meet these words. How is it that your spirit wants you to receive these words today, or needs these words today? So I'm going to give you a few moments of quiet so you can consider that. And then if you're willing, I'm going to call on, and you would use the raise hand thing for me to know I could call on you, just a couple people, so that I could engage with you in the way that I would and your fellow group members would in a group. So take a couple minutes. So what would happen next? And be thinking about whether there are one or two brave souls who would be willing to let me engage with you. But what would happen next is that someone would decide they were going to speak first. You don't have to raise your hand. Someone just speaks. And remember, a group is, when they're together, they have developed rules about confidentiality and trust and so on. But someone would just begin to speak and say, my words were whatever, and this is what came up in me. And they speak 1 minute, 3 minutes, whatever number of minutes it would be necessary in order for them to feel they've said what they needed to say. Meanwhile, everybody else, including me, are listening. And here comes the biggest challenge. As a listener, we have to edit ourselves out. So even if somebody said something that I'm very curious about, for my own sake, like I'd like to know what they meant by that, I can't ask them. Because we're not going to just engage in a discussion, you thought, I thought, and so on. Or if I had a thought myself, gee, that makes me think, can't do that either. But if I have an idea, if a question has come up in me that I think might help the speaker go deeper, I'm invited to ask that question. Then comes I think, even the most interesting part. Most times in life, when we're with people and they ask us a question, we make an effort to answer it. In this case, you have three choices. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. You can say, that makes me think, and you go right on talking about whatever it is you were discovering. Or you could say, that's a really good question, but I'm going to have to give it more thought before I'd want to try to answer it. So I think I'll take it home with me. Or you could say, thanks, I appreciate that you took the time to ask the question, but that's not where I was going at all. But thanks. In other words, you acknowledge the graciousness in somebody taking the time to ask you a question, but you preserve your own dignity and your own authenticity in your own right. So does anybody want to try that? And you don't have to, we have lots to say. Carolyn, did you want to try? You have to unmute.
My words were hope I don't cry, the duet of wonder and grief. I think of the wonder of helping my mother die, of telling her we're taking our last breath because she was really raggedy and she wanted to go, but she didn't want to go. And I said, everything is going to be fine. I want to take our last breath together. Breathe in right now. And she did. And I said, let's breathe out and go toward God, go to the light. And I felt incredible awe that she could die the moment I was going up with her. It was incredible. But of course, I also felt the horrible grief, the moment of losing her.
Take a breath. How is it that you're particularly in touch with that feeling today? What part of your spirit is being twinged? And you don't have to answer it right now, but that's an example of what might happen. And so Carolyn would then decide whether that's a question she wants to go forward with. She wants to take that question home, if you will. She's in her home right now, but we might be meeting in person again someday.
I'll answer it if I can quickly, because my husband is 10 years older than me, and I'm thinking, of course, of the potential of losing him and how horrible it would be. And I'm writing a memoir now, and I'm writing about my mother now. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could have that wonder and awe with him while he's going to live with afterwards?
May your mother's memory be for a blessing, and may your husband be around for many decades to come. I don't know. Okay. I'm trying to read what your name is, but your hand is up. So why don't you introduce yourself? And
hi, it's Alice, and I say all us for the inclusion of all of us. Hi, thanks for having me. My phrase is the web around the knot in my throat. And it was very visual. When I closed my eyes, it felt like first a safety net, and then that web around the knot felt like a dandelion that was old and going to flow away. So it was silence. And then it became a microphone, and it felt like, oh, my throat is just a microphone for my heart without my having to speak. And that's what I saw.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So is there one more person who would like to, and Claire and I will go back to our conversation. I think we're going back, or. Now, if I could comment a little bit more, let's see, why am I not seeing Or here?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. So keep in mind, please, that first of all, a group has to form and it has to become a unit with trust and so on. And before we would get to the poem, and there is a poem every time, we would have checked in, by which I mean people would share whatever it is they chose to share briefly that would help them to feel that they were most fully present in the room at that time. You know, we all come from something, we're all going to something, and it's hard to then say, take a deep breath. We need to settle down. So I don't sing, so I'm not going to do a nigun. So, and we don't necessarily begin with prayer, although I do have one group of cantors, and one of the cantors is here. And I have to say, one of the gifts that group has given me is that they begin with song, which is lovely because I could never do that. But anyway, we do that. We have the check-in. I present a quote, which is like a warm-up for the poem, same principle, same way of doing it. And then we do a bit of liturgy, by which I mean I bring a piece of liturgy, but I bring it with a question. Because what I'm interested in is not what did the rabbis mean when they put the liturgy down, or what did the designers of the gospel suggest when they presented that, but how does that particular bit of liturgy sit with you right at this moment? Reflect on that. And then, by then, it's almost a 2-hour mark, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we go through these things faster. So I always come with questions. The questions could pertain to the holiday cycle that we're in. It could be a direct question about God or spiritual practice. And again, we do that same, again, deep listening, deep sitting and quiet, deep listening on the part of to the speaker, and then reflection. In the first 6 months of a new group, I'm probably the only one that asks questions because it takes a while. And I've had years of doing this, so I can get to the questions a little faster, but gradually, to my great pleasure, I get to ask less and less of the questions, and everybody is asking them of each other. So that's what happens in a group.
Thank you, Roz. I was going to ask you to share a little more detail about the process and how it unfolds. Claire, I'm curious if you're willing to respond to the poem. So not just as an expert, as it were, but now as a participant. And then I have 1 or 2 more questions for both of you.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think that, Roz, in your book, you describe your use of poetry as a way of kind of shaking us loose, helping us to get to use language and to be present in a different way. So kind of getting out of our usual discursive patterns. So I love that. For me, it was, I am so sad, and the uniting of sadness and everything is so beautiful. I think the repetition of those phrases really stuck with me. I have another former student named Susan Forche who used to lead Lectio Divina at the school. And the phrase that she would use is, what word shimmers? So as you listen, and it could be to a scriptural text, I hope people know that, Roz, you're using poetry, but the most ancient practice is to use the scripture, and it's to hear the word repetitively. And I really like that phrase, what shimmers for you? So it's, for me, okay, so to respond personally, yeah, it's the uniting of I am so sad, said repetitively with and everything is so beautiful. And in a way, your choice of poetry in allowing the space for both of those emotions invites me in, because yes, I feel both of those today. And it's okay to be present with all of that. I think that's what the poem is inviting. It's okay to be present and to have my spirit present with all of that, and not lop one half off because now we're in the spirituality group and only some things are allowed. It's a kind of expansive inclusion, to use that word of Alice's as well. It's an inclusion that not only are we all welcome, but all of us are welcome here. So that's my response to the poetry exercise.
Thank you so much, Claire Ann, for sharing that captivating way of asking the question about what shimmers. I also think in your response, both personally and methodologically, you point to why the Book of Psalms is so often used in this context and in similar contexts, because I think those ancient poets gave others and give us permission to celebrate and to lament, to bring more of ourselves to this sacred undertaking, and including being angry, being at one's, limits, crying, singing out in joy. I often say, as Roz and Tom have heard me, when I'm teaching the Book of Psalms, it's a playlist for real life. And so, Roz, that was something that moved me immediately about the poem that you chose. I have a therapist who's also an avid meditator, who likes to say, you can't have poignancy without some sweet and some sour.
Absolutely. I will say that part of why, it's not like I've never used scripture, and I definitely have used Psalms because I think of them as the most ancient of poetry. But remembering that when I first started doing the groups, I was meeting with rabbis, and I was very aware of how much more they knew than I did about all these texts. But that didn't scare me. I figured I could learn. But what did concern me was that until they got used to and saw the possibility of the joy of the process, I might hear more about their most recent sermons in response to whatever text I chose, or Devar Torah's, teaching of Torah. And I wanted it to be for them, their deeper parts too. And so that's why I went to poetry.
Thank you, Roz, for that insight. I think it dovetails in some ways with my question before, and your very sweet and astute response to me about, what habitual patterns we are in. And so, what are the ways in which we are taught as clergy or as professors, to share in group situations, and how can you as a facilitator free us from some of that so that we can experience other dimensions of self and other. It's a beautiful, beautiful choice, including, which texts, what are all the associations I already have, and what will I spin forth? And
yes, and it just wouldn't, I just know it wouldn't have worked. Today, one of my groups is in its either 14th or 15th year, if you can manage that. By now, I could probably use a text, a scriptural text, and because they know the process now. There's a flow, and it really works.
So tell us a little bit about the Interfaith group in the last few minutes that we have together, because you approached me and Tom last year, and it's been a wonderful kind of stitching of relationships, both personal and institutional, involving Claire and BU. And you've been experimenting with this pilot group now for a few months. Give us at least one joy and maybe, if you're willing, an oi. But a note or two from the field, as it were, about this new this new group that you're stirring?
Well, in the book, I try to make the case for the fact that the methodology that I'm using in convening and facilitating the groups is not confined to whether I'm Jewish or Christian. But the truth is, I've never totally tested it. It was a deeply held sense that I had. And then January, a year ago, Professor Wolfteich was kind enough to invite me back into one of her classes, and she gave me the fabulous gift of inviting her students to read the methodology chapter of my book. And some of the students, after the discussion, asked her or communicated to her that they wouldn't mind being in a group. And I thought, well, why couldn't we put it together? Because then we could test my idea a little bit at least. And it seemed to me that it also embodied at a personal level a bit of tikkun olam that I could perform. Because if future clergy could learn to do God talk with each other, irrespective of religions, then they could bring that message to their communities ultimately, the way my parents brought it to me, right? This is who you are, but there's a world out there, and you can engage about what's important to you and learn what's important to them and have conversation about it. So all of that was there, and that's why I contacted you. And
Thank you for doing so.
You wanted a story. Okay, so my favorite wow story is when one of the Christian students said thank one of the Jewish students for helping enliven her prayer life. One student had been struggling over the inability to go to a house of worship because of COVID, and the other student had an idea that she was using for herself at home on the Sabbath to invigorate her prayer life. And the Christian student had tried it. Now, the Jewish student didn't tell the Christian student to try it. The Jewish student only talked about her own experience. The Christian student tried it, and it was meaningful to her. And she brought that feedback back to the group. And that was a wow. The oi is a more internal one for me in the liturgy section of my format, where I haven't yet brought anything that is frankly Christian in terms of the liturgy. I've brought words from Psalms. I've brought words that I know are common, but I haven't yet done the other. And I'm still exploring for myself what it is I might try, or what it is, that I have a couple possibilities that I'm working on. So that to me is still an oi, because I'm aware that I am hesitant about it. But as the group is now becoming more coalesced, I think we could go for it.
Right. Two thoughts, and then I want to invite Claire to offer a final thought or two, and then we will remind you how you can purchase this book. You could also purchase second or third copy as a gift to a colleague or a friend.
Well, one other thing, so we're probably not going to have time for questions. And so I want to be sure to put my email into chat so that if people have questions, if they felt free to ask them of me, I would try to respond. Yes,
so we'll make sure that there are at least a couple of minutes for questions in the chat. We'll make sure that we copy the chat. And that's very generous of you, Roz, to reach back out. One thought, which I think, Roz, is helpful for me as a person that's involved in interreligious work of different sorts, is to recall a statement by one of the founders of the interreligious dialogue movement in the United States, Leonard Swidler, who's now in his 90s, from Temple University. And he talked about a dialogue of the head, of the heart, and of the hands, and to continue to explore the different ways in which we can come together, and to remember that for different people, each of those will be meaningful in different ways at different times. So, this is yet another possibility in terms of the kinds of mending and healing work, for those that may not be engaged in social justice work, or may not be interested in study in more conventional terms, but that this opens the possibility for another space in which to meet. The other thought I had was, as you're continuing to explore, and we've talked a little bit about this, but specifically vis-a-vis your reflection about, Christian liturgy, perhaps you'll team with a second director who is Christian, and that person will offer Christian prayer or Christian liturgy. And is that more appropriate, less appropriate, or simply different than if you were to offer Christian liturgy one week, Jewish liturgy another week? So there are just some interesting questions, I think, to continue to explore around permeability, boundaries. How would a Christian hear a prayer from, a Christian source from a Jewish director, vice versa? So those are all wonderful kind of questions that I think are at the growing edge of this work. So I just wanted to throw that into the hopper. I don't know if you want or need to respond to that, but I also wanted to give Claire one more opportunity to share anything that's on your heart and mind.
Thank you. I'd love to leave room for a couple of questions or comments from folks here. So I just want to add that, in thinking about Christian traditions of spiritual guidance, the community, the group, there are many examples, right? From the Quakers to the Wesleyan bands to the, Benedictine communities of people affirming the importance of fellow witnesses and fellow companions. And so, Roz, I see your book in this great lineage, but trying to do something new for the contemporary context for our communities right here. And I just think it's a wonderful offering and a reminder to all of us that, whether it follows this formal process or is a more informal kind of companioning, that we do need each other and that we are witnesses to each other. And that in many of our traditions, it's the sense that the community is, that there is the empty chair in the group, and the empty chair represents the holy, the divine. So we are together co-listening for the presence of the divine among us. And I love that image. So I'll stop there. And thank you. Many thanks to Roz and to you, Rabbi Rose, for organizing this.
Roz, any last thoughts as I invite both in word and in text questions that people might have for you? And Tom, if you would just put Roz's email in the chat while she offers a last thought.
When Claire spoke just now, it reminded me of another difference between therapy and spiritual direction, which is that in spiritual direction, both the directee or the group of directees and I are looking in the same direction, either towards that which is transcendent or that which is deep in each of us. And that is not the case in therapy. In therapy, I'm looking at the person who has sought my help for their emotional problem, and they're looking at themselves too. And if they're looking at me, it's to see what it is I can offer to them, which is what I want to be able to do. So it's the looking, it's the direction in which we're looking that makes the distinction the sharpest. And the ultimate director is whatever it is that we name as our divine source.
Thank you so much for orienting us, Roz, to this art, this craft, this holy work. And by way of closing, Tom's going to just offer one more prayer. And again, Roz's email address is in the chat. The book information is in the chat. And I'm going to say thank you now so we can end on a prayerful note. Claire, thank you so much for joining us, for writing the foreword to the book, for being a teacher and a mentor and a companion to Roz. Roz, thank you for your courage, and your resilience and your generosity. And I'm honored to call you a colleague, a teacher, and a student. So I really want to thank you also for modeling this evening, just sharing openly and honestly, and inviting others to share from the depths.
Thank you, Or. Thank you, Claire, and thank you to all of you.
Tom, if you would pray us out, that would be wonderful.
All right. So I was inspired to share this prayerful dialogue across the centuries between St. Francis of Assisi, who Claire mentioned earlier, and Howard Thurman, who was also Dean of Marsh Chapel at Boston University in the 50s. St. Francis has this famous prayer and beautiful words of, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. And, may we seek to understand rather than to be understood, to love rather than be loved, etc. And Thurman offers this beautiful reflection on it, as he is known for his wisdom and beautiful words. So I'll read this to everyone, and you can read along if you're a visual person as well. But Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. These words, taken from the prayer of St. Francis, speak to one of the most insistent conditions of the human spirit. It is not easy to be an instrument of peace because we understand so little about the anatomy of hostility and its particular kind of etiquette. Again and again, we use our words to protect ourselves, to put others in their place, to humiliate and to wound, sometimes quite unconsciously. Have you ever been caught in the backwash of your words which hit their mark, resulting in an injury which was not part of your intent? All of this because you were too preoccupied with your own interests, your own concerns, to take into account the other person. At such a moment, your good word may easily become an instrument of violence. Therefore, Thurman offers this prayer to God: Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Teach me how to order my days, that with sure touch I may say the right word at the right time and in the right way, lest I betray the spirit of peace. Let me not be deceived by my own insecurity and weakness, which would make me hurt another as I try desperately to help myself. Keep watch with me, O God, over the days of my life, that with abiding enthusiasm I may be in such possession of myself that each day I may offer to thee the full, unhampered use of me in all my parts as an instrument of thy peace. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Laila Tov, good night. Go in peace.